Welcome everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 8th, 2020, and it is around 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Darren Pope, and I'm a developer advocate for CloudBees, and today we're going to talk about how to install Jenkins on CentOS 7 using Ansible and JCasC. Now you might say, well, didn't you already do a video about this? Well, yes and no. If you go back and watch the previous video, when we installed Jenkins on CentOS 7, we did everything manually. And today we're going to add in actually two different passes today. The first pass is we're just going to use Ansible, and in the second pass we're going to do Ansible and JCasC, so you can see how to build up your automation of managing your infrastructure for Jenkins just using something as simple as Ansible. Now you may not be familiar with Ansible, that's fine. I'll take you through some of the very basics of it, but we're not going to get into a very deep understanding of Ansible. There's no way to do that in a short time frame. If you're looking for some background on Ansible, maybe go check out a book called Ansible for DevOps by Jeff Geerling. That can be found on Amazon, on LeanPub. You can find it in a lot of different places. To me, that is one of my favorite reference materials for Ansible. And you can also check out Jeff Geerling's YouTube channel as well, and he has postings on there about how he's using Ansible. Now also, the way that if you've been using Ansible a lot in the past, when looking at what we're doing today, you may say, well boy, that's not the way I do Ansible. That's okay. My examples are going to be very, very simplistic, and they're going to map back to the previous video that we did where we did everything manually. So that's the reason why things are going to look, if you're used to Ansible, why they may look a little bit strange. If you have a better way of doing it, great. I'm just presenting a way to do it. I'm not setting out that it's the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me pull everything up here. Now, again, much like what we did in the previous video, and by the way, once I get finished editing, because we are doing this live right now, in theory, right up here, we should see a link, or if not, go down in the description. There will be a link to the previous video, how we did everything installed by hand before. I'm still going to be using Vagrant, and I've got two empty Vagrant CentOS 7 boxes. So if I just do a Vagrant status, we're going to see that I have a Jenkins instance that should show up here in just a moment. A Jenkins instance and an Agent 1 instance. And these are just setting empty. I've not done anything with these at all other than just do a Vagrant up to have the boxes available. Now, also, down in the description, if you were here with me live, if you scroll down and look in the description, there is a link off to a GitHub repository that I'm working from. It's Darren Pope /Ansible-Jenkins, and where I'm working at right now is CentOS 7, 7, and then 10 basic. This is where we're starting from today. Okay, let me go ahead and flip back to what is in this repository. Now this is the 10 basic under 7, and what we have here is a very basic setup for using Ansible. If you look at the README here that is in this repository, there is a prerequisite that you need to do. This may not still be true. I believe I might have pulled out this requirement even though the file is still here. I don't believe I still need this. I might need it for Ansible POSIX for some of the steps because I was changing up steps. But regardless, these won't hurt you anyway. If we take a look back now, under 10 basic, we have an inventory file, which is where our hosts are. So we have two hosts. We have Jenkins controllers as a grouping, Jenkins, and then agents grouping in Agent 1. So if I had 3 agents here, I'd have Agent 1, Agent 2, Agent 3, all with different IP addresses and whatnot. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this. Again, if you don't understand the basics of Ansible, I would still recommend getting the Ansible for DevOps book. It will help you from a basics point of view to get you going. Just understand we have a basic inventory file here that is pointing at the two instances that we have. Also, you'll notice at the very top, there's an all vars for SSH common args. This is something that's necessary for Vagrant to work the way that I've got things set up on my box. Okay, so that's part of the Ansible play, or not the playbook, but the Ansible setup. There's also a directory that I created called Playbooks. Inside of that, there is a file named VirtualBox YAML. The name doesn't matter. You'll see why in a few moments. And then also within Playbooks, there is a files directory. Inside of that files directory is a 30-JenkinsConf. Now, if you've watched the previous video, we went through and talked about how to set this up. It was the limits.d file. So this is the limits.d file that we created in the previous video. But now I've got it set up within my repository that I can use when I build my, or when I run Ansible to go ahead and do the installation for me. Now let's take a look at the playbook. This VirtualBox YAML is the playbook. And let's look at the basics here. You'll notice under here we're saying install base software on all. And what I mean by all, that means all hosts. So both on the Jenkins instance and the Agent 1 instance, we're going to be doing all of these steps. And you'll also see that here on line 3, which is hosts all. That's a magic word that says, if I see all, I'm going to do it to everything that's defined in my inventory. We're not going to go into the gather facts and basically become think sudo. That's because that's what it's doing in this case, since it's CentOS or any Linux-based agent. So the first thing we're doing is updating the etc host file. And this is doing some math to get the IP addresses from the inventory file and drop it into my etc host file on both of the instances. We set up the adopt OpenJDK yum repository. That's where we'll get our version of the JDK. We set up the endpoint yum repository because this is CentOS 7. By default, the version of Git that installs is a 1. Version. The endpoint repository gives us access to a 2. Git version that we can use on CentOS 7. CentOS 8 is different. We'll do another video about CentOS 8 and we'll compare and contrast those a little bit later. But anyway, the only reason that we're creating this endpoint yum repository is to be able to install Git. Next up, we uninstall Git if there is a Git installed, because if there was one installed on CentOS 7 box, then it's going to be a 1.x and we're wanting to use 2.x. So we want to get rid of what's there. And then what we're doing on all of our boxes, which right now the all is only 2, we're installing adopt OpenJDK 11. We're installing Git and we're installing font config because that's something that adopt OpenJDK needs in order to work with Jenkins. So these 3 packages will be installed on both the Jenkins instance and the agent instance. Next up, we're only going to work on the hosts that are part of the Jenkins controllers group. Right now, we only have a single instance. That instance name is Jenkins. Again, going back to what we did in our previous video of how we did everything manually, we enabled Firewall D, we opened up port 8080, then we set up the Jenkins yum repository. And right now we are pointing at the stable instance. So that means we're only going to be getting the LTS versions of Jenkins and not the weeklies. The weeklies have a different base URL. I believe it's just Red Hat and not Red Hat-stable. Then we're going to install Jenkins. Now, notice here that I am specifying a version. You don't have to. The reason why I'm specifying a version is that way, as new LTSs come out, I can test them when I'm ready to test them. So I could have just as easily left this Jenkins and it would have installed the most recent version of Jenkins, which in this case is 2.263.1. I'm doing this. You don't have to do this. In fact, if I was going to be using this playbook to maintain a Jenkins controller over time, I would not specify that version. I may still specify a version, that way I can control when something gets upgraded to a specific version, but I don't have to. But that's the reason why I'm doing it right now, is just because, also to remember, the previous video that we did, the current LTS at that time was 2.249.3. Since that time, a new LTS has released. That version is 2.263.1. Okay, so that will basically do a yum install Jenkins 2.263.1. Next, I create a couple of directories. Again, this goes back to what we did in the manual. We created a varcache temp, varcache Jenkins temp, and a varcache Jenkins heap dumps. We make modifications to etc sysconfig Jenkins, which in our case, we're just adding in the location of tempdir, so we're not using just /temp. And we also add in the plugin root to Jenkins args. Next, this is where our 30.jenkinsconf file comes in. What this says is we're creating the limits file. We're saying the source is 30-jenkins-conf. Now, since we're running, when we run this playbook, and you'll see it in a few minutes, it's going to reference a files directory. It's not explicit here, it's implicit. So based on where the playbook lives, if you have a files directory right next to it, then that will be where the source will come from. I believe either in the next part that we do with JCasC, we have some subdirectories, but in this case I have just a top-level directory, a top-level file with no subdirectories. We'll see how that works a little bit later. Then we just start Jenkins. So we did all the things in these lines from line 100 back to 43, so roughly 60 lines, 57 lines of Ansible YAML gets me to the point of having Jenkins installed on that instance. And that's 57 plus the handful of things that we did in order to get Java and Git installed. Now, for our agent, the hosts that we're going to target are the hosts that are in the agents group. Again, firewall D, set up port 22. We remove any Docker that may be there. We set up Docker CE stable so we can install Docker. We go through and install Docker and also unzip because we need to unzip. We set up a couple of more things that are necessary for post-installation post-installation on Linux-based systems, which is what the add Docker group, add user, and we do a reset just to get everything going again. We also install Maven. We install Gradle. We set up some symlinks. We set up a profile. Now we install Gradle. And then we're done. And then finally we set the final ownership of optools to Vagrant because that is the user that we have for this instance. Now, let's go back over to, and by the way, if you're here with me live, go ahead and say hi over in the chat. I've got chat over here to my left, your right, and I'll comment back to you when I can here. Now, since I've run this a few times, let's look and see what we're doing here. So I am in my CentOS 7 10 basic directory. So I am now in this level right here. I say Ansible-Playbook -I, which says, okay, which inventory file do I want to use? And I say inventory/VirtualBox hosts, which is underneath inventory VirtualBox hosts. Again, the name doesn't matter. It's convention to use inventory and playbooks, but then from within inside of that, name it what you want. Then I pass in a space, so there's no extra dashes here. So it's Ansible Playbook -I inventory VirtualBox host space playbooks VirtualBox YAML. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run this. Now, if you think back to how long it took when we did a manual installation, right now the time is 1:14:30, let's call it that. What's going to happen is this is going to wake up and start installing. Now, again, going back to when we did the manual installation, it took roughly an hour. And towards the end of that hour, I started speeding up quite a bit. Now we're starting at about 1:14:30, and assuming I don't run into any mirror issues, because if you watch the manual, I ran into a mirror issue when doing the yum install of Jenkins. Right now we're doing an install of the JDK, Git, and font config on both of our instances, on both Jenkins and Agent 1. That's what this task is here. And again, if you're looking for help in understanding, okay, what does all of this mean? Ansible for DevOps, a great book by Jeff Geerling. Go check it out. Okay, we'll wait for this to go. Usually this is a little bit faster. This is very odd. But I won't rush. Again, we're doing this in real time. We're at about a minute in. And, oh, by the way, since we're here for a moment, if you haven't subscribed to CloudBeast TV yet, go ahead and subscribe. Anytime there's new videos that come out or we're scheduling live streams, if you go ahead and click subscribe, ring that bell, that way you'll be able to be notified anytime there's new content available on CloudBeast TV. Okay, so we got past OpenJDK, or excuse me, adopt OpenJDK, Git. We've installed Jenkins. We've got all these other things happening already. In fact, we're already beyond Jenkins, and now we're down on the agent. Now we've already set up the Docker repository. Now we're installing Docker and that unzip, so we're in that section. So we're getting close to the bottom. We're roughly about 2 minutes in right now. So we'll give this just another minute. We get our Docker info set up. Now we're installing Maven. We're installing Gradle. And we set our ownership and we're done. So about 2.5 minutes from about 14:30 to roughly right at 17, everything's installed. All done. Except we still need to go through and set up our Jenkins instance. So let's go ahead and do that. So Jenkins 8080, we need to go and grab our unlock key. So I'm going to vagrant SSH to Jenkins. In fact, let me just do a clear so it's a little bit higher. So vagrant SSH Jenkins and sudo cat that. So there's my admin password. I'll paste that in. I'm going to install suggested plugins. Now, as these plugins are being installed, let me lead you towards where we're going in the next part of today's video. We are going to use the plugins that are installed by default as our starting point for being able to completely configure this controller out of the box. So what we're doing right now is sort of a normal process that I would do, is I would manually in some way, shape, or form, whether it's completely manual or like what I'm doing right now with Ansible to sort of fast track some things for me. I would go through, set up a controller manually, figure out the plugins that I need, and then from that point, I go ahead and set up my JCasC and my plugin installation to manage all of that for me. Now, almost done with this. Another little trick, by the way, the other reason why I specify which version of Jenkins that I'm using during the installation process, in this case 2.263.1, is because the install suggested plugins can change from version to version. So in the case of when I upgraded from 249.3 to 263.1, there was actually a plugin that was removed. That's no longer part of the suggested plugins. So I had to go through and reconcile that to get ready for the baseline for 263.1. All right, so now we have an admin user. Right now, since this is all local, this is just admin. I'm not doing anything. This is not on the internet, not exposed to the internet in any way, shape, or form. So I'm okay doing this. If your instances are exposed to the internet, don't use simple passwords. In fact, probably don't even use simple usernames. We'll save and finish and click on Start Using Jenkins. Now, I've got my controller set up correctly. What I need to do now is go through and set up a couple of things like we did with the manual process before. First things first, we went in and disabled the executors on the controller itself. So let's wait for this to pop back up. There we go. I'm going to set my number of executors to 0. I'm going to set the label to some kind of garbage. It doesn't matter. And then the usage is going to be only build jobs using this node. Okay. I click Save. So now I have no executors available. Manage Jenkins. Configure system. Oh, wait, no, that's not true. What I'm doing is I'm creating a new agent. So new node, agent 1. And if you're, I'm not going to go into the detail like I did in the manual video. So if you need some more reference, you can go back and look at that section of the video. Okay, remote Vagrant Jenkins -agent. Labels is Linux. I'm going to only build jobs. SSH. My host is agent 1. I'm going to add a credential. The username is Vagrant, as well as the password and the ID and the description. Again, in real life, on real networks, you would want something much stronger than that. Okay. We'll set the credential to Vagrant, set the host key verification strategy to non-verifying, and then let's click Save. Now it's launching. I'll go ahead and click on that. I can watch the log. And by the time I'm getting here, it's now connected online. So if we take a look back at nodes, now I have my agent with a single executor on it. Now I can create a job. Now, we'll create a test pipeline. Go down here, let me grab my example pipe for this. So label Linux, and then a handful of steps there. Let's see how this works out. Build now. There is one, we'll watch it run. There's my Maven version, my Gradle version. I'll go back to here. So I'll go to the top. Maven version of 363, Gradle version of 661, and then here's my Docker info showing 19.3. Okay. Very simple, very easy. However, remember I was saying as we were going through the setup process, that we're going to use this controller as the basis for building out our JCasC configuration. What does that mean? Jenkins configuration as code gives you the ability to make your configuration of your controller completely as code, thus configuration as code. So I'm going to cut back over here. And let's get set up for this. So in order for me to do that, I need to install a plugin. So I'm going to go to Available. And I'm going to do configuration-as. I'm going to do configuration as code. I am going to do install without restart. I typically don't recommend this, but for right now, I'm okay with it because we will reboot it to make sure everything's fine. And then that's pretty much it. That's all that I need. So if I go back over to Dashboard, Manage Jenkins, there's now this new section under System Configuration called Configuration as Code. And this gives you the ability to see what the configuration is. Now, the export is not intended to offer a directly usable Jenkins YAML configuration. I'll explain why that's important in a minute. It can be used for inspiration, but the export can be a partial or fail for some components. So let's go ahead and click on View Configuration. We have credentials here, which this will be useless for you on a fresh install. And the reason why is the secret that exists is what is used to encrypt this password. On an initial installation, that's a brand new secret. Therefore, when this gets created, it's not going to be the password that you expect. In my case, because I've set it, I expect my password to be Vagrant. If I was to use this credential section on a fresh, brand new installation, yes, a username password credential would be created. Yes, it would have a description of Vagrant, an ID of Vagrant, a username of Vagrant, but the password would not be Vagrant. Now, this is up to you. Maybe that's okay. Maybe you want to use this, and then you just know that, okay, hey, look, I went in and created this. Now I need to go in and update the credential or the password for the credential, and then I'm good to go. Seems like a reasonably valid use case. The bigger problem is, and again, this is your decision that you have to make, is checking in a credential to a source-controlled environment that could be exposed accidentally, and half of your credential is exposed just in the username. So in my use case, where I'm doing everything locally, this is just a demo. This is not necessarily best practice. A better practice would be using something like Hashi's Vault or Thycotic or CyberArk or any of the other stores, AWS's Secret Store or Azure's Secret Store, I can't remember the names, those kinds of things. If you're using something like that, you would still need a credential to hook up to that environment, but then all of your real credentials are living in that environment. In that case, I would probably manually create a credential after everything's set up to hook up to those things and then go on about business. It would just depend on how isolated my environment is. If I have any type of connection to the internet in any way, shape, or form, I'm probably not going to do this. Whether it's proxied or whatever, just because I don't know. If I'm completely air-gapped, I'm still going to question it. But this is an option, and we're going to look at a different way to do it that isn't necessarily any better, but it's a different type of option for you. Notice these top levels. I have a credentials top level, I have a Jenkins top level, and I believe in this environment, and then unclassified is another top level, and tool. So in this case, tool, unclassified, Jenkins, and credentials. Those are your 4 top levels. Now, here's another thing that you may not be able to handle, because I tripped over this, in fact, yesterday working on another example. In the case of Update Center, which is right here, you may not want to leave that in, because when a controller restarts, so you do a systemctl restart Jenkins, if you had any other update centers in that definition, they would get overwritten with this single value. In my case, I actually had this value and another value. And I had forgotten that I was using JCasC to provision this controller. And I was wondering why I was not able to see plugins from that secondary update site or update center. this was the reason why. So if you were to go back and look in the repository, you can see that I ripped out all of the update center definitions late yesterday, which was December 7th. So when you create your YAML, you've got to make sure that you're pulling things out that shouldn't be there. Now again, other than those couple of things, we'll take a look and see what we can do here in just a moment. Okay, so I have my configuration as code complete, quote unquote complete. So I would grab that file that's showing there. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start leaning into the 20 JCasC part 1. So let's take a look at this in a moment. The first thing I'm going to do while I'm talking is I'm going to go ahead and destroy my 10 basic setup. And then I'm going to switch over to 20 dash and get a vagrant up, and we'll go back and look at what we're getting ready to run so you can understand what is going to happen. So we'll wait for the shutdown here real quick. We'll still be done probably by the top of the hour. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to go over to 20. I'm going to do a vagrant up. This will take a couple of minutes. So while that's coming up, I will take us back over to 20. Now, inventory file is exactly the same as 10. So we're in the 20 directory now. The inventory file, exactly the same. In fact, everything else is pretty much exactly the same, except the playbooks. Now you'll notice under playbooks, we have the files directory again, but here I have subdirectories. I have an init groovy D, which we'll look at those files in a few moments. I have my limits D, which is where I now put my 30 Jenkins comp file. I have a Jenkins YAML, that is the configuration as code file that's been modified. We'll look at that. But then I also have a plugins YAML file. Let's start there for a moment. So I have a plugins file called plugins.yaml, and this is a listing of all of the plugins that I exported from the 10-basic controller that were existing at the point in time that I wanted to create that snapshot, that prototype. In other words, I had gone through and set up everything the way that I wanted it. I didn't do it live with you right now, but in a previous time, I went through and set it up the exact way that I wanted it, and then I created a list of all of the plugins that were installed. And in fact, you can see here, I'm including configuration as code because I need that in order to be able to load my Jenkins YAML file. So this list with configuration as code, and I also included pipeline utility steps, which is not installed in suggested. So I created I added 2 plugins to this setup. I didn't do it manually. I went through, I did available, I got all my plugins, and then I did a listing of all the plugins that were installed. There's numerous ways to do that. I will probably go through those options in a different video. Just assume for the moment that I went into var lib Jenkins plugins, where all the HPI files are and the JPI files, and I just did an ls there and created this file from that listing of files. That's a simple way to do it. Okay. But you may be asking yourself, how do we install these plugins? How do we use that? Well, let's take a look at VirtualBox. Oh, actually, before we go back to our playbook, let's take a quick look at Jenkins YAML. Remember when I was going through the UI of that, I said don't use credentials. Remember in the top of that YAML was the big credentials block right above Jenkins. So I've removed that. I'm not loading up credentials in that fashion. I'm loading them up in a different fashion in this use case. Again, we go through and set up everything just like we were doing manually. We can see the num of executors is 0. I've got a label string of ASDF WERF, which was my junk label for my controller. And then all of the other settings that we did are all in this setup. It's actually fairly vanilla other than the number of executors and the, where am I at? And the label string. Okay, again, pretty simple. Now let's take a look at our YAML. Now this YAML, VirtualBox YAML, which is the playbook, is a little bit longer than the one that we just saw in 10. So the 20 playbook is a little bit longer than the 10 playbook. And you'll understand it as we go through it. The install base software on all is exactly the same as the 10. So 20 and 10's install all, exactly the same. Now in the 10, I set up Jenkins first, and then I set up the agent. A playbook runs sequentially. So although, like in the case of all, I can install all on all instances at the same time, it's still going to do these all together. I don't really care about it. But then in going through this, I realized there was some race conditions that could occur if I did the controller first and did the agents second. In other words, I need to have my agents completely done and ready prior to the controller coming up and trying to connect to the agents. So, and it may not matter. It may be a problem in how I have my playbook written. Again, I am not an Ansible expert. I'm just using this as a basis to help show you a way to do it. But in this case, I have a common agent installation. Now, I broke this out because I might have multiple types of agents, but I may want different tools on the types of. So maybe I have 2 or 3 agents that have Maven only. Maybe I have 2 or 3 agents that have NPM only, but they all need firewall D22, and I want them to all have Docker. So think of this as just a naming convention. I just created a common one. So here's my Docker installation with unzip, and that was it. So basically I want Docker on everything, on all my agents, no matter what. And in this case, let's say this was going to be a Java-based agent primarily, so I also included Maven and Gradle. Now technically I could have put all this together in that single one, but I broke it apart for a couple of different use cases. Now we get into the controller setup. Now I'm going to spend more time in this, but we're still going to be good towards the end of the hour. Let me help you understand what's going on here. Again, we start out with firewall D, get port 8080 open. We set up our Jenkins repository. We do the installation. We create our directories, temp and heap dumps. But notice now that I also have created var lib Jenkins plugins, not var cache, but var lib. Because what's going to happen when we actually start the Jenkins process is part of our Jenkins home directory is already going to be populated. And here's how that's going to happen. We're going to modify our sysconfig file. We already headless comes by default. We are passing in this new parameter now. We haven't seen this one before. It's called Jenkins install run setup wizard false. So that means when you bring up Jenkins the first time, the setup wizard would not run at all. So that means it's on me to get everything ready so when we actually do the start, everything is already in place that needs to be in the right place so that when it starts up in the state that I want. And then we have tempter. So the only difference between 10 and 20 right now to this part of sysconfig is adding in run setup wizard. Now plugin root is still var cache Jenkins plugins. Notice that it is var cache and not var lib. We create our limits file. Notice how we reference this. It's now beginning limits d /30 -JenkinsConf. Going back to under the files directory, there's a limits d directory, and then our 30 JenkinsConf. Now here's where things start getting different than 10. We download the Jenkins Plugin Manager, also known as the Plugin Installation Manager tool. And what this tool gives you is the ability to take that plugin YAML file. In this case, plugin YAML is just going to go into the root of my Vagrant user, so home Vagrant plugin YAML. I then also copy this Jenkins YAML file into var lib Jenkins. So this Jenkins YAML file is in the root of my Jenkins home directory. And then I copy in the two init files, which we'll look at in just a minute, the init groovyd files, into var lib Jenkins init groovyd. Now, if you've not looked at the init subsystem of Jenkins, this gives you the ability to run processes once Jenkins gets far enough along in its startup, and you can inject things on startup. So let's take a look at what these two files are in our case. You can have as many as you want. They are processed in, it's not alphabetical order, but in order. I don't remember the right word for it. So I've got two files here. I have a create admin user, and I have a create vagrant user pass credential. Remember, we did not put our credential in the Jenkins YAML file. I chose to do it this way. Neither of these are secure. Let me repeat that. Neither of these ways are the secure way to create credentials. As an example, this is a way to do things. If you know that everything's going to be completely air-gapped and you're going to have any network access for a moment to where you can go in and change it immediately afterwards, your call. But let's take a look at what these are. So in lines 4 through 7, basically I'm saying, hey, go find the file .disable-create-admin user. And if that file exists, return, meaning don't go through the rest of this. So basically by putting this in here and setting the disable script at the very end, then what that means is this will only execute one and only one time. If I didn't have this up here, then this would run every time on startup. There's use cases to where you may want to do that sometimes, other use cases where you want to do it this way. We'll see the same model in the second one in just a moment. So in this case, I get a handle to the Jenkins instance. I create a new account within Jenkins. So this is using Jenkins' own user database. And then we give it the strategy of full control once you're logged in. We set the security realm, the authorization strategy, we save, and then we create the new file. So this is creating my admin user. So this script would run first based on how it's named. The second script is creating my Vagrant username and password credential. Again, it's following the same model. We're setting a disable script. However, in this case, the name is different. This is disable create Vagrant user pass credential. Get a handle to the instance, get a handle to the domain. We get a handle to the system credentials provider. We create a new username and password. We add the credential to that domain and that password. We save it and we create the new file. So now, and I don't remember the order here, but let's assume that it's user, pass, ID, and description. I don't remember if that's the correct order or not, but let's assume that is. Again, remember I'm saying this is not secure. This would be a plain text password. This would be a plain text password. It's not good. I'll leave it up to you. From a security perspective, not a great idea, but for you to understand, okay, how can I do these things? This is an option. Okay, So I've got 2 init files. Let me go back over to my playbook. So we're saying copy the init files in from the source directory. So, and by this is an Ansibleism to where, because of how I have referenced it by saying init groovyd / it says give me everything that's in this directory and put it into this directory, noticing that that trailing slash is there as well. So think of that as sort of a star. Then next, what we're going to do is we're going to run the Jenkins plugin manager. And we just give it the command java-jar Jenkins plugin manager. I point it at my war file. And then I give it my plugin file. And then I tell it where to download the plugins to. Notice it's var lib Jenkins plugins. That looks familiar, right? It's because we created that directory up here. Because we have not started our Jenkins process yet, the pre and post install scripts have not run from the RPM. So we need to prepare our file system to be able to land files where we need them. So we run this process, and then right before we start it, we change the ownership of var lib Jenkins to Jenkins and Jenkins. Then we start the process, and then we go. So let's take a look at this real quick. Let's go back over here. All right, so let's go ahead and do a vagrant status just to make sure that everything's good. Whoops, I misspelled that. Okay, I've got both of my boxes up and running. And let's run our playbook. We'll go through, set up everything on our 2 instances together. So font config, open JDK, git. And in case you're dropping in here while this is running again, if you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. Click the subscribe button. You can ring the bell. That way you'll be notified anytime there is new content on CloudBees TV. Now, once this finishes, next up we're going to create our agent and get it configured. And then finally we're going to create and configure the Jenkins controller. So we'll give this just another few seconds here. Again, this is running in real time. If you look in the upper right hand corner, you can see the clock ticking by. It's at 48:04. Again, these boxes are fairly small, and I'm running on a little constrained system. Got enough headroom, but not a ton. Okay, now we're moving through. We're setting up our agent. We're getting Docker installed on the agent, which is close to the end of the agent setup. Well, actually, that's not true. We're about in the middle because the next two will be Maven and Gradle. And you can pick the tools that you need. I mean, if you have Docker, technically you don't need to put any other tools on your agent because in theory you could use Docker for all your tooling. But you may still want to have other tools directly on the metal, or the VM in this case. Okay, there's Maven. There is Gradle. Now we're installing our controller. We're installing Jenkins. Let's see if we get through this fast today or not. Yep, that went better. Notice here that we created the var lib Jenkins plugins directory. That's getting us ready for our plugin installation manager. We're running the Jenkins plugin manager right now. So it's taking that plugin YAML and figuring out what versions need to come down, taking those files and putting them into var lib Jenkins plugins for us. Again, this will take probably just a moment. That was somewhere between 80 and 100 plugins. In fact, let's just go see how many plugins are being installed. So -1. It's a little high, 77. So we have 77 plugins being installed. So it's going out, downloading those, and putting them into varlib Jenkins plugins, in our case, because we told it where to put them. Give it up. Okay, it finished. We change up the ownership, and then that's it. Now, if you think about it, and I didn't look at the start time on this one, but that was probably just a couple of minutes again. Now, if you think about it, when we did it towards the beginning of this video, it took about 2.5 minutes, but we still had to go through and set up our user, go through the setup wizard, set up our user, connect up the agent, do all of those things. Let's go look and see what happened now. So if I go here to Jenkins 8080, and I just happen to have this saved in LastPass. Note that agent is already set up. Manage Jenkins. Configure system. We can see configuration as code is there. But here's to prove this is the different one. If we take a look at, because remember, I did a destroy of everything that was in 10 and I set up a new vagrant box for 20. But you may still not believe me. Well, if you remember back in 10, where I did ASDF, 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 here is ASDF WRF, which is what is in Jenkins YAML right here on line 13. So everything, including my credential to connect up to my agent, all completely done. So in under 2 minutes, even though I did under the 10 version, it took 2.5 minutes to get set up and then probably another, I don't know, 5 minutes maybe. So still 7 minutes, not a big deal. But here, I was able to take everything, the installation, the configuration, creating my admin user, configuring how I want configuration as code set up, my agent connected. All of that stuff is done. The only thing that I didn't do is create a job. So I can come right in here, do a test pipeline, go and grab my little sample tester here, go down here to this, click save, and then do a build now. Okay, there's Maven, Gradle, and Docker. So in under a couple of minutes, I have a completely fresh new setup. Set up exactly the same as before, but now I was able to turn it from manual, fully manual, to partially manual, meaning I've got everything installed, but I still had to go through and set up, to now as everything's automated, including the creation of a user and setting up a credential and connecting my agent. All completely automated for us. Again, maybe not the best security way of doing things, completely understand. So that would be the thing that you would say, okay, well, how do we do that? And that would be dependent upon your environment. Like what I did, maybe fine in your environment. Maybe it's a lower environment, you don't care. Or maybe in your environment, you could even do it in a mid-tier environment, but you probably wouldn't do it in a production environment. In other people's environments, you may not do anything in lower environments. Everything has to be completely different. So in this case, you may not be able to take this as is, but if you're just testing this out to see how it works, this may be good enough for you. Now, hopefully this session was helpful for you. If you have some questions, you can reach out to us. You can contact us on CloudBees Devs, or The other thing you can do is reach out to me on Twitter, which my things are on Twitter at Darren Pope directly. Also, if you are, again, one more time, if you have not subscribed yet to CloudBees TV, go ahead and click on subscribe, ring the bell. That way you'll be notified anytime there is new content available on CloudBees TV. Now, if you have some more questions, you can, again, reach out to us on Twitter and be watching this channel for more content coming up. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next video.